Before we begin, I need you to understand something. What you're about to hear is not entertainment. This is a record of something that happened in a place that still exists, in a house that still stands, where the air itself remembers what occurred within its walls. If you're listening alone, perhaps you shouldn't be. If you're listening in the dark, perhaps turn on a light. Not because of what I'm going to tell you, but because of what you might feel while listening. This is the story of the Caldwell sisters, Constance and Millisent, who kept something locked in their attic for 37 years. And when that door was finally opened, it revealed a secret so profound, so disturbing, that it changed everyone who discovered it. We begin in 1903 in the hills of Vermont, where a house stood watching over a town that pretended not to see it, where silence became a kind of violence, and love twisted into something unrecognizable. This is not a ghost story. This is something worse. This is what happens when duty becomes imprisonment, when protection becomes torture, and when a promise made in grief echoes for decades like a curse that cannot be broken. My name is irrelevant. I am simply the one who pieced together what happened from documents that were never meant to be found, from journals written in hands that shook with exhaustion and guilt, from testimony given by people who wished they could forget what they had seen. The Caldwell sisters are dead now. Everyone involved is dead. But their story remains, waiting in archives and attics, in the memory of a house that refuses to forget, demanding to be told not as a warning, but as a testament to how far human beings can fall while believing they are doing the right thing. The house was called Raven's Hollow, though no one remembered why. It stood 3 miles from the town of Millbrook, Vermont, perched on a ridge that caught the worst of the winter winds and baked under summer sun with no shade to soften the heat. Built in 1869 by Marcus Caldwell, a textile merchant who profited from the Reconstruction era, the structure was designed to impress rather than comfort. 2.5 stories of dark timber, steep gabled roof, narrow windows that seemed to watch rather than welcome. By the time our story begins in earnest, Marcus had been dead for 7 years, taken by a stroke in his study while reviewing account books. His wife Eleanor followed him 14 months later, her death attributed to heart failure, though the town doctor privately noted she simply seemed to stop wanting to live. That left their 3 children: Constance, born 1867, Millicent, born 1872, and between them, a son named Victor, born 1870. Or rather, that should have left 3 children. But by 1903, when our account properly begins, only the 2 sisters remained visible to the world. Victor Caldwell had not been seen outside the house since he was 16 years old. Not at church, not at market, not at his father's funeral or his mother's. The town had largely forgotten he existed, and those few who remembered assumed he had died young or moved away. The truth was far more terrible, and it began not with violence, but with sickness. Victor had been born with what the doctors of that era called nervous troubles. Today we might recognize the symptoms of severe mental illness, perhaps schizophrenia or a related psychotic disorder. But in 1870, such conditions were poorly understood and deeply feared. As a child, Victor experienced episodes, periods of confusion and terror, where he could not distinguish reality from the visions that plagued him. His parents, wealthy enough to afford discretion, kept him home, hired private tutors, and constructed what they believed was a protective barrier between their afflicted son and a world that would not understand. Marcus Caldwell was a proud man who built his fortune on reputation and respectability. The thought of his only son being institutionalized, subjected to the barbaric treatments common in asylums of the period, was unthinkable. So the family absorbed Victor's condition in silence, adapting their lives around his episodes, learning to recognize the signs of an oncoming crisis, developing routines that maintained a facade of normalcy to the outside world while managing chaos within their walls. Constance was the eldest, and from her teenage years, she assumed much of Victor's care. Journal entries discovered decades later reveal a young woman of fierce intelligence and deeper loyalty, determined to protect her brother from a society she correctly understood would offer him no mercy. Millicent, 5 years younger, was gentler, more easily frightened, but equally devoted. The sisters became practiced at deception, explaining their brother's absence with carefully rehearsed lies, though few people asked. In that era, families routinely concealed disabled or mentally ill relatives, and neighbors respected such silences. The crisis that would define the rest of their lives occurred in March of 1886, when Victor was 16. The details remain fragmentary, pieced together from Constance's journals and later testimony, but what is certain is this. During a particularly severe episode, Victor became convinced that his parents were imposters, demons wearing familiar faces. In the grip of this delusion, he attacked them. Marcus Caldwell died from blunt force trauma to the skull, struck repeatedly with a fireplace poker. Eleanor Caldwell was strangled, her neck broken in the struggle. The sisters found them in the morning, and found Victor catatonic in the corner of the room, covered in blood, no longer aware of what he had done. They had a choice in that moment. They could summon the sheriff, report the killings, and watch their brother be tried, convicted, and hanged. Mental illness was rarely accepted as a defense in that era, particularly not for a crime so brutal. Or they could do what their mother had gasped out with her last breath: protect him, keep him safe, never let the world take him. Constance was 19 years old. Millicent was 14. And they chose to keep their promise. What followed was an act of deception so elaborate, so carefully maintained, that it succeeded for nearly 4 decades. The sisters cleaned the crime scene with methodical thoroughness, removing every trace of violence. They dressed their parents in nightclothes and arranged them in their beds. Then they waited 3 days before alerting the town doctor, claiming they had been visiting an aunt in a neighboring county when their parents passed peacefully in their sleep. The doctor, elderly and not inclined to ask difficult questions of grieving daughters, certified natural deaths. Marcus was ruled to have had another stroke. Eleanor's heart simply stopped. The funerals were quiet affairs. The sisters stood side by side in identical mourning dress, accepted condolences with appropriate reserve, and began their new life as orphaned women living alone in the family home. Except they were not alone. Victor remained, hidden in what would become his permanent prison, the attic. The sisters converted the space over a period of weeks, working at night when no one could observe. They reinforced the door, installed multiple locks, covered the windows from inside with heavy boards. They brought up a bed, a chamber pot, and the few belongings Victor recognized from his childhood room. And they began the routine that would consume the next 37 years of all their lives. Every morning before dawn, Constance would climb the stairs with food and water. She would unlock the 3 separate locks, prepared for whatever state she might find her brother in. Some days he was lucid, recognizing her, speaking of books he remembered reading, or music he wished he could hear. Other days he was lost in delusion, cowering from her, or raging against the chains they had installed during his more violent periods. Millicent would join her for the more difficult tasks, bathing him, changing his bedding, treating the sores that developed from long periods of immobility. They became experts at managing a deteriorating human being, learning through trial and error what modern nursing manuals could have taught them, but which they could never risk consulting. They purchased medical supplies through carefully spaced transactions at different merchants, never buying too much from one place. They ordered food in quantities that seemed excessive for two women, deflecting questions with vague mentions of preserving for winter or feeding farmhands that didn't exist. They maintained the fiction of normalcy through sheer force of will and exhaustive attention to detail. But isolation has costs. Cut off from society by both their secret and their dedication to keeping it, the sisters aged prematurely. Constance's hair went gray before she was 30. Millicent developed a nervous condition that manifested in tremors and occasional episodes of dissociation, where she seemed to forget where she was or what she was doing. They stopped attending church, stopped accepting social invitations, stopped being anything other than the strange Caldwell sisters who kept to themselves up on the ridge. The town speculated, of course. In small communities, mystery breeds rumor. Some said the sisters were mad with grief. Others whispered about witchcraft or devil worship. The more practical suggested they were simply eccentric spinsters living off their inheritance. No one came close to guessing the truth. That above their heads, locked in perpetual darkness, a man who should have been dead or imprisoned continued existing in a state that was somehow worse than either fate. Victor's condition deteriorated over the years. The violent episodes became more frequent, necessitating longer periods in restraints. His lucid moments grew rarer. The intelligent boy who had once read philosophy and played piano became something less than human, reduced to basic functions and animal responses to stimuli. He forgot language for months at a time, then suddenly remember it all at once, screaming out questions about why he was imprisoned, what he had done to deserve this, begging to be released or killed. The sisters endured. What else could they do? They had made their choice in 1886, and every day since had only deepened their complicity. To free Victor now would mean revealing what he had done, what they had concealed. They would be arrested as accessories to murder, likely imprisoned. Victor would be executed. The promise they had made to their dying mother would be broken. So they continued, trapped by their own loyalty, in a situation that had long since passed beyond any possibility of a good outcome. The years blurred together in a monotonous horror. 1890, 1895, 1900. The new century arrived with its promises of progress and modernity, of automobiles and electric lights and social reform. None of it touched Ravenshollow, where time had stopped in 1886, and 3 people remained locked in an endless repetition of suffering that had no purpose except to continue. There were close calls over the years, moments when discovery seemed inevitable. A traveling salesman who heard shouting from the attic and asked questions. A repairman hired to fix the roof who noticed the excessive locks on the attic door. Each time, the sisters managed to deflect, distract, or in one case, bribe their way back into secrecy. But secrecy is a dam that eventually breaks, and the pressure behind it builds with every year it holds. By 1903, the sisters were living at the absolute limit of human endurance. Constance, at 36, looked 60. Millicent, at 31, was losing her grip on reality, sometimes talking to people who weren't there, sometimes forgetting Victor was her brother and treating him like a stranger who had invaded her home. Victor himself was 43, though he looked far older, his body wasted from decades of inadequate nutrition and no exercise, his mind so fractured that it was unclear if any coherent self remained. Then came the catalyst that would begin the final chapter of their story. His name was William Foster, and he was a photographer. In 1903, photography was still relatively new, and Foster had conceived of a project to document rural America before modernization erased its distinctive character. He traveled through Vermont that summer, taking pictures of old houses, covered bridges, dying farms, and the people who inhabited these fading worlds. When he saw Ravenshollow from the road below, he knew immediately it would be perfect for his collection. The house had everything he wanted: architectural interest, isolation, a sense of time standing still. He climbed the ridge on a bright August afternoon and knocked on the door, his camera equipment in a leather case over his shoulder, ready to ask permission to photograph the exterior. Millicent answered. She seemed confused by his presence, as if visitors were so rare she had forgotten the social protocols for dealing with them. Foster explained his project, showed her examples of his work, and asked politely if he might take photographs of the house from several angles. It would only take an hour, he assured her. He would not need to come inside. Millicent looked back over her shoulder, seemed to listen to something Foster couldn't hear, then nodded hesitantly. She told him to work quickly and closed the door without further conversation. Foster spent the next hours setting up shots, adjusting his camera, capturing the house from various perspectives. He noticed several odd details: the boarded attic windows, the excessive locks on all the doors, the complete absence of any signs of normal domestic life, like hanging laundry or a kitchen garden. But he attributed these to eccentricity and paid them little mind. He was packing his equipment when he heard it, a sound from the attic, clearly audible despite the closed windows and boarded glass. A rhythmic banging, like someone striking a wall or floor with a fist or chain. Then a voice, male, shouting words Foster couldn't quite make out, but whose tone communicated unmistakable desperation. Foster stood frozen, his photographer's training making him hyper-aware of details. The sound came from the attic. The windows were boarded from inside. No smoke came from the attic chimney, though smoke rose from the lower floors. Someone was up there, and whoever it was, they sounded distressed. He approached the door and knocked again. This time Constance answered, and Foster was struck by the profound weariness in her face. Before he could speak, she said, "You should leave now, Mr. Foster. Thank you for photographing our home. Please don't come back." "There's someone in your attic," Foster said. "Someone who sounds like they need help." "You're mistaken. Old houses make many sounds." That was a human voice. Constance's expression hardened. "Our private family matters are not your concern. You've taken your photographs. Now go." "If someone is in distress, I have an obligation." "You have an obligation to mind your own business." Her voice dropped to something cold and dangerous. "If you speak of this to anyone, if you bring trouble to this house, you will regret it. We have endured more than you can possibly imagine, and we will not be destroyed by a stranger with a camera and an inflated sense of righteousness." Foster left, but he was troubled. That night in his boarding house in Millbrook, he considered his options. He could report what he'd heard to the local sheriff, but report what exactly? A sound from an attic? The word of sisters who might simply have an elderly or disabled relative they cared for in privacy. He had no proof of any crime, only suspicions. On the other hand, he couldn't shake the desperation in that voice, the sound of someone who needed intervention. In the end, he decided to wait, to observe. He extended his stay in Millbrook, asking careful questions about the Caldwell sisters, learning their history, or rather, learning the sanitized version the town knew. He learned about their parents' deaths, about their withdrawal from society, about the rumors that surrounded them. And he learned that no one had seen Victor Caldwell in nearly 20 years. That detail crystallized his suspicions into something approaching certainty. He returned to Raven's Hollow 3 days later, this time without his camera, climbing the ridge in evening dusk when he was less likely to be seen from the house. He circled the structure, examining it from all angles, noting the patterns of light in windows, the movements of shadows within. And then, patient and still, he waited. Around 9 in the evening, he saw the sisters emerge from the front door, each carrying a lantern, walking toward a small cemetery that bordered the property. He watched them disappear among the headstones, then made his decision. He approached the house and tried the front door, locked as expected. He moved around to the back and found a window that opened with only modest effort. He climbed inside, finding himself in a dark kitchen that smelled of old food and neglect. His heart hammered as he stood in the darkness, listening. The house was silent, except for the settling sounds all old structures make. He found the stairs and began to climb, moving as quietly as possible, each creak of wood under his feet seeming impossibly loud. On the second floor, he found the narrow staircase that led up, and at the top, the door with its 3 heavy locks. He stood before it, hand raised to knock, and hesitated. What was he doing? Breaking into a private home based on a sound he'd heard and suspicions he couldn't prove? But then, from beyond the door, came a voice. Weak, desperate, unmistakably human.
"Please, is someone there? Please help me."
Foster made his decision. He examined the locks and realized he had no way to open them without tools or keys. But the door itself, though heavy, was old wood. He backed up and threw his weight against it. The frame splintered slightly, but held. He struck it again, and on the 4th impact, the locks tore free of the weakened wood, and the door burst inward. The smell that emerged made him gag. He pulled his handkerchief to his face and stepped inside, his eyes adjusting to the darkness. What he saw in that attic would haunt him for the rest of his life. A man, skeletal and filthy, chained to the wall by one ankle. The chain was long enough to allow him to reach a corner where a chamber pot overflowed with waste, and a stained mattress that looked like it hadn't been changed in weeks. The walls were covered in scratches, some forming words, others abstract patterns made by someone with too much time and too much despair. The man looked up at Foster with eyes that were both human and not, awareness mixed with madness, hope drowning in decades of abandonment.
"Please," the man whispered. "Please get me out of here."
Foster knelt beside him, examining the chain. It was secured with a padlock he had no way to open. "I'm going to get help," he said. "I'm going to bring the sheriff. You're going to be free."
"No,"
the man said, his voice suddenly urgent.
"No, you don't understand. If you bring the sheriff, they'll kill me. They've kept me alive all these years, but if you force them to choose between their freedom and mine, they'll kill me. They killed the last person who found out."
Foster went cold.
"What?" "The immigrant. Years ago, man named Chen. He discovered me. They killed him. Buried him somewhere on the property. My sisters, they're not evil, they're just broken. We're all broken. But they'll do what they have to do to protect themselves now. They've come too far to turn back."
Footsteps on the stairs interrupted them. Foster turned to see Constance and Millicent standing in the doorway. Constance held a rifle, old but well-maintained, pointed directly at his chest. "I warned you," she said, her voice empty of emotion. "I told you to leave well enough alone."
"You can't keep him like this," Foster said, standing slowly, hands visible. "This is torture. This is a crime."
"Everything about this is a crime," Constance replied. We crossed that line 37 years ago. We buried our parents in false graves after our brother killed them in a fit of madness he couldn't control. We've kept him prisoner since then because the alternative was watching him hang for something he never meant to do. We killed a man who threatened to expose us. We've lived in this hell for decades because we made a promise to our dying mother, and we have nothing left except that promise. Do you understand? We have nothing. No life, no future, no hope. Only duty. Only the obligation to protect him, even though protecting him has destroyed us all. So what now? Foster asked. You kill me too? How many bodies will you bury before you admit that what you're doing is wrong? Wrong? Millicent's voice came out shrill, breaking. You think we don't know it's wrong? You think we haven't thought about ending this every day for 37 years? But how? How do we end it without destroying everyone? If we release him, he'll be executed. If we turn ourselves in, we'll be executed. If we kill him ourselves, we become the monsters everyone feared he was. There's no good choice. There never was. We've been trapped since 1886, and all we've done is survive one more day, and then another, and another, until survival became the only thing we knew how to do. Foster looked between the sisters, at Victor chained to the wall, at the rifle that never wavered. He saw the absolute despair in all of them, the way they had become locked together in a triangle of suffering that had long since ceased to have any purpose except to perpetuate itself. You don't have to do this, he said quietly. We do, Constance replied. Because if word of this gets out, it doesn't matter what you intend or how you frame it. The result is the same. Victor dies. We die. The promise breaks. Everything we've sacrificed means nothing. Then let me help you, Foster said, surprising himself. Let me help you find a way out that doesn't require more killing. There is no way out. There has to be. Nothing is truly without options. But first you have to lower that gun. And you have to trust that I'm not your enemy. I'm just someone who heard a cry for help and responded. That doesn't make me your destroyer. It makes me a potential ally, if you'll allow it. The gun wavered. Foster saw the exhaustion in Constance's arms, the way she could barely hold it steady. How long since she'd slept a full night? How long since either sister had known a moment without dread? Why would you help us? Millicent asked. You don't know us. We've done terrible things. Because, Foster said carefully, I believe there's a difference between people who do harm because they enjoy it and people who do harm because they're trapped. You're trapped, all three of you. And maybe there's a way to free you without anyone else dying. The sisters looked at each other in that silent communication of people who'd lived together in crisis for decades. Finally, Constance lowered the gun. You have until morning, she said. If you can think of a solution, we'll listen. If you can't, then Mr. Foster, I'm sorry, but we will do what we must do to protect ourselves. We're beyond redemption anyway. What's one more sin? Foster spent that night in the Caldwell attic, listening to three people tell the story of their shared imprisonment. Victor, in his lucid moments, described the overwhelming terror of his mental illness, the way reality fractured around him, the horror of waking to find his parents dead by his own hands. He talked about the early years of his confinement, when he'd still believed it was temporary, that his sisters would find a cure or a solution. Then the middle years, when hope died and only routine remained. And finally the recent years, when he'd begun to forget why he was chained, forget even who he was beyond a creature that existed in darkness and pain. Constance spoke of the impossible weight of responsibility, of being 19 years old and having to decide whether to honor her mother's dying wish or surrender her brother to justice. She described the elaborate deceptions, the constant fear of discovery, the gradual erosion of everything that made life worth living.
"We are not alive," she said. "We haven't been alive in decades. We're just performing the motions, maintaining the mechanism of his survival, without remembering why it matters."
Millicent was the most broken of the three. Her account was fragmentary, interrupted by episodes where she seemed to forget where she was or who she was talking to. She spoke of conversations with their dead mother, of feeling Victor's madness seeping into her own mind through proximity, of knowing she was losing herself but being powerless to stop it.
"We've become ghosts," she said. "All of us. Haunting this house, haunting each other. Dead, but unable to leave."
Foster listened to all of this, his photographer's eye noting the details, his mind working through possibilities. By the time dawn light began filtering through the gaps in the boarded windows, he had the skeleton of a plan. It was not a good plan. It solved nothing permanently, and would require deceptions as elaborate as those the sisters had maintained for decades. But it offered something they hadn't had before. A possibility that didn't end in death for everyone involved. "Here's what I propose," he said, gathering them around. "Victor dies, officially. We stage his death from natural causes. I have contacts in the medical community who might be willing to provide documentation without too many questions. We bury him in your family cemetery with a proper headstone, dated appropriately to suggest he died years ago. That removes the immediate crisis. The secret becomes simply a matter of concealing a death rather than concealing a living person."
"But he's not dead,"
Constance said. "That's the second part. We relocate him. There are private facilities, discreet places that handle difficult cases. With your family's remaining money and my connections, I can arrange a transfer to a place where he'll be cared for properly, where his condition will be treated with at least some semblance of medical understanding. The staff won't know his real identity. He'll simply be another unfortunate patient with a generous family trust paying for his care."
"And us?" Millicent asked. "What happens to us?"
"You become two sisters who've spent years in isolation caring for a disabled brother who finally succumbed to his ailments. You're free. You can leave this house, leave Vermont if you want. You can have whatever remains of your lives."
"It's still a deception," Constance said. "It's still a lie."
"Yes," Foster agreed. "But it's a lie that frees you rather than imprisons you. And sometimes, Miss Caldwell, the choice isn't between truth and lies. It's between different kinds of lies. And we're allowed to choose the ones that cause the least harm." Victor spoke for the first time in an hour. "Do it. For God's sake, do it. I don't care if I live or die anymore, but let my sisters go. Let them have something that resembles a life. That's all I want. Let them be free of me." The plan took 3 weeks to execute. Foster called in favors, made arrangements, and told carefully constructed half-truths to people who were willing to not ask too many questions for the right price. A doctor in Burlington provided a death certificate dated 2 weeks prior. Victor Caldwell had died of heart failure, his body released to family for burial. The funeral was private, just the sisters and Foster standing over a coffin that was filled with weighted fabric. The headstone was real, though, erected in the family plot. Victor Caldwell, 1870 to 1903, beloved son and brother. The actual Victor was transported in darkness to a private sanatorium in upstate New York, a facility that specialized in caring for the mentally ill with families wealthy enough to afford discretion. He was registered under a false name with a fabricated history. The staff were told only that he was a patient with severe psychiatric disturbances and a family that wished to remain anonymous. The Caldwell sisters signed over a substantial portion of their remaining inheritance to ensure his care for as long as he lived. Foster stayed in Millbrook for 2 months, helping the sisters adjust to their new freedom. It was harder than any of them anticipated. For decades, their entire existence had been structured around Victor's captivity. Without that organizing principle, they seemed lost, uncertain how to inhabit normal life. Constance would wake at dawn out of habit, preparing a breakfast tray before remembering she no longer needed to. Millicent would freeze at sounds from above, still expecting to hear chains rattling or desperate cries for help. They sold Ravens Hollow that winter. Neither could bear to remain in the house that had been their prison for so long. They moved to a small apartment in Burlington, attempting to build lives from the fragments that remained. It was not successful. The weight of what they had done, what they had endured, proved too heavy to simply set down. Constance lived 4 more years. She died in 1907 from pneumonia, but those who visited her in her final illness said she seemed to welcome death.
Seemed to view it as a release from a burden that had never truly lifted despite Victor's relocation. Her last words, whispered to a nurse, were, "Tell him I'm sorry. Tell him we did our best." Millicent survived longer, but not better. She was institutionalized in 1910 after a breakdown in which she became convinced Victor was still locked in an attic somewhere, still calling for help. She spent the last 15 years of her life in a mental hospital, quiet and mostly unresponsive, occasionally singing hymns in a voice so broken it barely qualified as sound. Victor himself lived until 1918. The staff at the sanatorium noted that once he was removed from the attic, his condition actually stabilized somewhat. He had moments of clarity more frequently, periods where he could hold conversations and express himself coherently. But he never fully recovered, never became the person he might have been if his illness had been treated earlier, properly, with compassion rather than fear. He died during the influenza pandemic, one of thousands who succumbed that year. His body was cremated, and his ashes scattered on the facility's grounds, unclaimed and unidentified. The man who had been Victor Caldwell disappeared from the world as thoroughly as he had disappeared from the attic, leaving no trace except in a few encrypted records and the memories of those who'd known his story. Foster never spoke publicly about what he'd discovered or what he'd helped conceal. He continued his photography work, traveling through rural America, documenting the dying traditions and fading landscapes. But his work took on a darker tone after his encounter with the Caldwells, a fascination with isolation and hidden suffering, with the ways people could be trapped not by physical barriers, but by circumstances, by loyalty, by promises made that became impossible to keep. He died in 1931, and among his effects was a sealed envelope addressed to be opened after his death. Inside was a full account of the Caldwell case, written with the detail and precision of a photographer's eye for truth. He ended his testament with these words, "I have wondered, in the years since, whether I did the right thing. I helped perpetuate a deception. I assisted in concealing a crime. By any standard of law or conventional morality, what I did was wrong.
But I saw their suffering, all of them, trapped in a nightmare that had long since ceased to serve any purpose except to perpetuate itself. And I believed then, as I believe now, that mercy sometimes requires us to choose the less wrong option when no right option exists. Judge me as you will. I have judged myself endlessly and found no clear answer. The house, Ravenshollow, stood empty for nearly a decade after the sisters left. Local children told stories about it, claimed to hear sounds from the attic, saw lights in the boarded windows. Whether these were genuine hauntings or simply the way traumatized space retains the echo of suffering is a question beyond empirical answer. In 1917, a fire of unknown origin destroyed the upper floor, including the attic. Some said it was arson, others claimed lightning. Still others whispered that the house itself had finally decided to erase the evidence of what it had contained. The remaining structure was demolished in 1920, the lumber sold or burned, the foundation filled in and covered. A small memorial park occupies the site now, a few trees and benches where people come to enjoy the view of the valley below, unaware of what once stood above them or what occurred within those walls. The Caldwell family plot in the Millbrook Cemetery contains 5 headstones: Marcus and Eleanor, Constance and Millicent, and Victor, whose grave is empty, but whose name, at least, exists in a place where anyone who cared to could find it. No one tends the graves anymore. The family line ended with the sisters, their potential for descendants sacrificed along with everything else they gave up to keep their promise. Time has softened the story into legend, and legend has simplified it into a cautionary tale about madness and isolation, about the dangers of keeping family secrets. But those who study the case closely, who read Constance's journals or Foster's testimony, or the medical records from the sanatorium, understand it's not that simple. This is not a story about good people or bad people. It is a story about people who made a choice in an impossible moment, and then spent the rest of their lives trapped by that choice, unable to move forward or back, locked in a present that stretched out endlessly, with no possibility of redemption or escape. It is about how love can become indistinguishable from torture, how protection can be a form of cruelty, how duty, honored past the point of reason, becomes its own form of madness. The Caldwell sisters were not monsters, though they did monstrous things. Victor was not a monster, though he committed murder. The tragedy is not that they were evil, but that they were human, painfully human, struggling with questions that had no good answers and choosing options that seemed like the lesser evil at the time, but compounded into something worse than any of them intended. We want stories to have clear morals, to teach us lessons about right and wrong, but some stories resist that simplification. Some stories exist only to show us the terrible complexity of being human, the way circumstances can trap us, the way the best intentions can lead to the worst outcomes, the way we can love someone and destroy them simultaneously without contradiction. Constance and Millisent Caldwell kept their brother locked in an attic for 37 years. They killed a man to protect their secret. They lied systematically for decades, and they did it all because they loved Victor, because they promised their mother, because they believed they were saving him from something worse. Were they right? The question is meaningless. There was no right choice, only a series of increasingly terrible options, each one foreclosing possibilities until they found themselves so deep in deception and suffering that they could no longer imagine any way out. This is what makes their story not a ghost tale or a murder mystery, but something more disturbing. A demonstration of how ordinary people, faced with extraordinary circumstances, can create their own private hells and inhabit them for decades out of a sense of obligation that long ago ceased to serve any purpose except to justify the suffering already endured. If there is a lesson here, it is not about mental illness or family duty or the ethics of promise-keeping. It is about the danger of sunk costs, of continuing a terrible course of action simply because we've already invested so much in it, of mistaking endurance for virtue, of believing that suffering must have meaning, when sometimes suffering is just suffering, pointless and self-perpetuating, and worthy only of being ended, not honored. The Caldwell sisters endured beyond any reasonable measure. They kept their promise beyond any rational point. And in the end, all they achieved was to extend Victor's suffering, destroy their own lives, and add more death to the original tragedy. They deserved better. Victor deserved better. Even Robert Chen, the immigrant farmer whose only crime was compassion and curiosity, deserved better. But they didn't get better, because sometimes life offers only terrible options, and we have to choose anyway. And then we have to live with the consequences of those choices, even when they destroy us. The attic door at Ravens Hollow was locked for a terrifying reason, not because of what was behind it, but because of what that locked door represented. The lengths human beings will go to protect what they love, even when protection becomes indistinguishable from torture, even when the cost exceeds any possible benefit, even when everyone involved is begging for it to end. In our desire for simple stories, we want to know who was guilty. The answer is everyone and no one. The situation was guilty. Circumstances were guilty. The inadequacy of their era's understanding of mental illness was guilty. The lack of any social support system that might have offered alternatives was guilty. But Constance and Millisent Caldwell, Victor Caldwell, even William Foster, who helped them maintain their final deception, these were just people trying to navigate an impossible situation with limited information and no good choices. They failed. Of course they failed. No one could have succeeded in that situation. The tragedy is not that they failed, but that they tried so hard, for so long, sacrificing everything, achieving nothing except the prolongation of agony for everyone involved. This is the story that historians reference when they discuss the treatment of mental illness in the early 20th century, when they examine the burden placed on families by a society that offered no real support for managing psychiatric conditions, when they explore the deadly power of family secrets and the weight of promises made in extremity. But beyond its value as a historical case study, the Caldwell story endures because it speaks to something timeless in human experience: our capacity for destructive devotion, our talent for convincing ourselves that terrible actions serve good purposes, our tendency to continue harmful patterns simply because we've already invested so much in them that stopping feels like admitting it was all for nothing. The sisters believed they were protecting Victor. In the end, they were only protecting their own sense of having done the right thing, protecting the meaning they'd assigned to their suffering, protecting the narrative that made their sacrifices bearable. Victor himself, the supposed beneficiary of all this protection, lived and died in circumstances far worse than what he would have faced if they'd simply reported the original crime and accepted the consequences. This is the terrible irony. The attempt to save him destroyed him more thoroughly than justice ever would have. And recognizing that irony, facing that truth, would have required them to admit that everything they'd endured was pointless, that their loyalty had been misplaced, that their mother's dying wish had damned them all. It's easier to continue. It's easier to lock the door again, to climb the stairs again, to feed the prisoner again, to maintain the deception again, than to face the possibility that you've wasted decades on a terrible mistake. So they continued until they couldn't anymore, until William Foster broke the cycle from outside, until circumstances finally forced an ending that none of them could choose for themselves. Even then, the ending was not redemption. There is no redemption in this story. There is only cessation, the stopping of a pattern that should have stopped decades earlier, the release of people who should have been released before they forgot what freedom felt like. The attic is gone now. The house is gone. The people are gone. But the story remains, and it remains because it shows us something we need to see even though we don't want to. That love without wisdom is dangerous. That duty without questioning is destructive. That keeping promises for their own sake, regardless of consequences, is not virtue, but cowardice dressed in noble language. We would like to believe that if we were in their situation, we would have made better choices. We probably wouldn't have. Given the same circumstances, the same information, the same fears and pressures, most of us would likely have made similar choices, would have found ourselves similarly trapped, would have continued similar patterns long past any rational justification. That's what makes this story not an aberration, but a cautionary tale. Not a unique horror, but a demonstration of ordinary human weakness amplified by extraordinary circumstances until it becomes monstrous. The Caldwell sisters were not special. They were simply people who loved their brother, who made a promise, who chose to honor that promise regardless of cost, and who paid the full price of that choice over nearly 4 decades of suffering that benefited no one and saved nothing except their own sense of having remained loyal. Was it worth it? Ask Victor, who lived 37 years in chains and died in anonymity. Ask Constance, who welcomed death as a release. Ask Millicent, who lost her mind trying to maintain sanity in an insane situation. Ask Robert Chen, whose body lay in an unmarked grave because he showed compassion. None of them would say it was worth it. But none of them could stop it either, because once begun, the pattern took on a life of its own, and all of them became its servants rather than its masters. This is the terrifying reason the attic was locked, not to protect the world from Victor, but to protect the sisters from facing the truth. That they had trapped themselves in a prison of their own construction, that they were guards and prisoners simultaneously, that the key to freedom had always been in their hands, but using it required admitting that everything they'd suffered had been unnecessary, and that admission was more than they could bear. So they kept the door locked, and the locks only grew stronger with each passing year, until breaking them required force from outside, until someone who hadn't invested decades in the deception could see clearly what they could no longer perceive. That this was not protection or devotion or honor, but a shared delusion, maintained by 3 broken people who had forgotten any alternative existed. The story ends, as all stories must, but its implications continue. In medical ethics courses, the Caldwell case is studied as an example of family care gone catastrophically wrong. In psychology, it's referenced in discussions of codependency and pathological caregiving. In sociology, it illustrates how secrets function in closed systems, how families can become isolated units, operating by internal logic that seems rational from inside, but appears insane from outside. But perhaps most importantly, it should be remembered simply as a human story. A story of people who failed not because they were uniquely terrible, but because they were trapped in a situation where failure was the only possible outcome, where every choice led to suffering, where the only question was how much suffering and who would bear it. They chose to bear it themselves and to force Victor to bear it with them. That was their choice, and it was wrong, but it was not incomprehensible. We can judge them, and should, But we should judge them with the humility of knowing that faced with similar impossibilities, we might make similar mistakes, might convince ourselves that our terrible choices were necessary, might lock our own doors and throw away our own keys and call it duty. The house is gone, but houses like it remain, places where families keep secrets, where suffering is hidden behind closed doors, where people are trapped by love that has curdled into something toxic but still calls itself love, where promises made long ago still bind people to courses of action that serve no purpose except to fulfill the promise. This is not history. This is perpetual present, recurring in different forms, with different details, but the same essential structure. People who love each other destroying each other, convinced until the very end that they're doing the right thing, unable to see that sometimes love requires letting go, that sometimes promises should be broken, that sometimes the greatest courage is not in enduring, but in stopping, in admitting we were wrong, in choosing a different path even after decades on the wrong one. The Caldwell sisters never found that courage. Most people don't. It's easier to keep walking in the direction we've been walking, even when the road leads nowhere, even when we've known for years it leads nowhere, because changing course requires acknowledging that we've been lost, and acknowledging that we've been lost means facing all the time we've wasted, all the suffering we've caused, all the opportunities we've missed for something better. So we continue. We climb the stairs. We unlock the locks. We perform the rituals of our imprisonment. We call it loyalty or duty or love. And we never quite admit, even to ourselves, that we're as trapped as the person we're supposedly protecting, that we've built our own prison, cell by cell, that the key has always been in our hand, and that using it has always been possible, but never quite bearable. This is the legacy of the Caldwell attic. Not a ghost story, but a mirror. Not a historical curiosity, but a warning. Not an aberration, but a demonstration of how easily any of us could become them, given the right circumstances, the wrong promise, and the human capacity for self-deception that allows us to continue terrible patterns indefinitely, calling them necessary, calling them honorable, calling them anything except what they are, prisons we build for ourselves and then pretend we have no choice but to inhabit. The door was locked for a terrifying reason, but the most terrifying reason was the simplest, because they chose to lock it. And then they chose not to open it. And then they convinced themselves they had no choice. And then they lived with that conviction until it killed them. That's the horror. Not demons or madness or evil, but ordinary human weakness, perpetuated, rationalized, and maintained until it destroys everyone it touches. The house is gone, but the lesson remains. The attic is demolished, but its metaphor endures. The Caldwell sisters are dead, but their story continues because it's not really about them. It's about all of us, about how we trap ourselves, about how we convince ourselves our traps are necessary, about how we live in prisons of our own construction and call them homes. If you're listening to this alone in the dark, perhaps turn on a light now, not because of ghosts, but because of the more unsettling truth, that we carry our own attics with us, our own locked doors, our own prisoners we're keeping for reasons we can no longer remember, but feel compelled to continue honoring. The question is not whether the Caldwell sisters were right or wrong. The question is, what are you keeping locked away? What promise are you keeping beyond reason? What pattern are you maintaining because stopping would mean admitting you were wrong to start? These are the questions that haunt more thoroughly than any ghost, that disturb more deeply than any murder, that persist longer than any house or attic or chain. These are the questions the Caldwell sisters never answered, and that we must answer for ourselves, individually, with full awareness that getting the answer wrong can consume decades of life in suffering that serves no purpose except to perpetuate itself. Their door is broken now. Their chains lie in pieces somewhere in a Vermont landfill, metal debris from a demolished house, meaningless to anyone who didn't know their history. But the metaphor survives, demanding we examine our own locked doors, our own unnecessary suffering, our own prisons maintained out of habit or duty, or the inability to admit we were wrong. This is what makes the story not entertainment, but testimony. Not a ghost tale, but a mirror. Not history, but perpetual warning. The Caldwell attic was locked for a terrifying reason, and somewhere, in some form, yours might be too.